Today's poem is Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, better known by its first line, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Now, this is traditionally a love poem, a love sonnet, but towards the end of this lesson, we're going to flip the script on that a little bit, and I'm going to show you how context can make a huge difference in the meaning of words, in the meaning of poetry, but in the meaning of words, how important context is. So first we're going to read this as a love poem, and I'm going to tell you some things that I think are really important for you to know about the poem and about poetic analysis. So the first thing I want you to know is sonnets are 14-line poems. If a poem doesn't have 14 lines, if it has 15, if it has 23, if it has 13, it is not a sonnet. It must have 14 lines. Sonnets also have a very tight structure in their ending rhyme scheme. We're not going to study the various types of sonnets, but this is a Shakespearean sonnet, so I want you to realize that the rhyme scheme is very predictable in sonnets. Let me get my pen back here. So, in the case of a Shakespearean sonnet, the rhyme scheme is always the same. A, day, temperate, doesn't rhyme with day, so it's B. May rhymes with day. Date rhymes with temperate if you bend it. It's a bent rhyme. You have to change how you pronounce the word in order for it to really work correctly. But it is actually considered a rhyme. Now, so we got AB, AB. This is the first quatrain it's referred to, which is a 4-line grouping. We move on to shines. That's C. Dimmed. Doesn't rhyme with anything above it. That's D. Declines rhymes with shines. Untrimmed rhymes with dimmed. Then we move down to fade. That's the end of a quatrain right there. That 4-line grouping that Shakespeare likes to do. We go to fade, which doesn't rhyme with anything above it. And we go onest. Oest is how it's written, but it's onest, like you own something. That's F, shade and fade, growest and oest. And then after that quatrain, being 3 quatrains, then you have the heroic couplet, the rhyming couplet at the end. C and thee, which doesn't rhyme with anything else. All Elizabethan or Shakespearean sonnets, which are 2 words for the same thing, have this exact rhyme scheme. Quatrain AB, quatrain CD, quatrain EF, and heroic couplet GG. So, that's the quick down and dirty of rhyme scheme. And that's as far as we're going to go with poetry scansion as such, breaking down the meter and the rhyme scheme. So, let's read the poem now. As we read the poem, imagine it as Shakespeare or the narrator, the persona, talking about his beloved. And I'm going to underline some things that I think are important as we go, and then I'll come back and discuss those things. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaves hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and oft is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou ownest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. by today's standards, it's very cliche. It's very overdone. I'm not sure it would have been in Shakespeare's time, because a lot of people have borrowed from Shakespeare so much that these lines have become quite cliche. And love poetry can be a little too sentimental. That sentimentality, which is one of our literary terms on our list, can be extreme. So we start off with a rhetorical question. Rhetorical question I did add to your updated notes. It's a question designed to make you think, or not necessarily to be answered, although in this case he does give us an answer he wants, but it's designed to make the audience, the reader, think a little deeper about the nature of the situation being brought up. So he's asking, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Then he goes on with his logic here. Thou, now this is Shakespearean English for you, as is thee. Thee and thou are two forms of you. Thou would always be used as at the beginning of a sentence. Thou art more lovely and more temperate. You're more lovely and more comfortable, more pleasant than the summer, a summer's day. In other words, he's saying it's not a good comparison because, my beloved, you are much, much more pleasant and more lovely than any summer's day. Then he goes on to name some of the problems with summer. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. Sometimes the rough winds come in May and knock the beautiful flowers off the plants, and that's not pleasant. That's not as pleasant as you. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. Students sometimes get confused, but they know what a lease is. A lease is something you have or rent, or something you possess for a short time. It's a short time possession. So here he's saying the length of summer is too short. It's too short. It doesn't live up to the beauty that you are, your eternal beauty. There's also potentially, because I'm going to give you another interpretation of this, there's also potentially foreshadowing here. Foreshadowing. Hinting at something to come. He continues on about how summer falls short of being a good comparison for his beloved. Sometimes too hot the eye of heaven shines. Now, we talked about these phrases back in Beowulf. This is almost a kenning. Now, some people would argue it's not, but it's taking the place, it's a descriptive phrase taking the place of the name of the sun. Wow. And then of his, this pronoun refers back to the sun. Sometimes the sun shines too hot and it's uncomfortable, and that doesn't fit a description of you. That's not a good comparison of you, my beloved. And often his gold complexion is dimmed. Clouds cover the face of the sun sometimes, and his gold, beautiful complexion is dimmed, and your beautiful complexion is never dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes decline. Okay, students sometimes get confused with fair because they're thinking fair and unfair, and they forget that they learned when they were young that fair could also mean beautiful. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? So here, fair is used for beauty. And every beauty from beauty sometimes declines. Every beauty declines. By chance or by nature's changing course untrimmed. Nature changes its course. The seasons begin, the seasons end. So again, the summer's still not a good comparison to the timelessness of your beauty and amazingness. Now here we have a bit of a turn. He's talked about how the summer day and summer itself falls short of the comparison here. I've got a lot on the screen, so I'm going to exit out of that. But this but here is now switching to the other side of the comparison. But thy, your, don't get hung up on this Shakespearean language, your eternal summer shall not fade. Your eternal summer shall not fade. Your beauty will never fade. He's not necessarily talking about physical beauty. Keep that in mind. When you fall in love with somebody, it's not just a physical thing. It's a emotional thing. It's a psychological thing. It's in love with a human soul. And so he's talking a little bit wider than just physical beauty. And probably hasn't been all along. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. Now, he's fitting into a very tight meter here. Iambic pentameter, he is keeping the same number of syllables in each line. So instead of saying ownest, he has removed that word, which is what an apostrophe and a contraction shows, or he's removed two letters, and we get that. It's to fit into the rhyme scheme, or the meter of iambic pentameter. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. This is more potential foreshadowing. There's an acknowledgement here, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. There's an acknowledgement here that his beloved will eventually pass away, as we all do. But even death will not take away that beauty. Now, here, this colon is important. At the end of a Shakespearean sonnet, at the end of many types of sonnets, you have this heroic couplet at the end that rhymes. And it usually has some sort of summation, or maybe a twist in logic, or a revelation, a revealing of some new information, or something like that. And so we do have a shift here. We stop talking about the summer day and the beauty of his beloved, and now we start talking about something related but not quite the same. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this. This gives life to thee. Now, in class, my students have always have a hard time with what this refers to, this pronoun, this. Pronouns always refer to something, and they struggle. And it's probably a little too obvious, or a little too simplistic. Not simplistic. It's maybe too obvious, and students are thinking too deep. Literally, so long lives this poem. As long as this poem lives, and this poem gives life to thee. He's saying that in a way, he has written this line to preserve the sense of beauty and wonder of his beloved. And as long as men can breathe, we breathe to recite poetry, we breathe to speak, we read with our eyes. He's saying as long as there are men that can breathe and eyes that can see, as long as this poem survives, it gives life back to you, my beloved. Huge sentimentality. It can be nauseating sentimentality. So, that is more a traditional view of this poem, a quick down and dirty. But I want to give a potential alternative interpretation of this poem. And there is no historical real proof of this, but it is a theory that a few scholars, most don't, but a few scholars have come up with. But I do think that it illustrates the importance of context. The context in which you are reading a document, what you believe to be the author's purpose, or the context in which you believe the words to exist. So let's change the context. We've assumed, we've believed, and it seems that this is a poem about romantic love. A man being in love with a woman. But what if the poem was written at a crucial time in Shakespeare's life. There are a few scholars, not many, many who have not even heard this, but there are a few that claim that it seems like Shakespeare, from the best they can tell of when this poem might have been written, that Shakespeare wrote this after the death of his son, Hamnet. Hamnet took ill. It was not unusual for children to take ill. Child mortality was much greater in Shakespeare's time than it is in our modern day and age with vaccinations and antibiotics and those sorts of things. Unfortunately, Shakespeare apparently was not even with Hamnet. Shakespeare was in London. He kept his family in Stratford. And by the time he returned, his son had already passed away. And I believe they'd already even buried him at that point because they couldn't keep bodies around that long. There are a few that think that perhaps this was written shortly, within a short period of time, months, weeks, a year, something like that, after the death of his son Hamnet. I don't know whether that's true or not, and I don't know that it really matters. But I want to show you how context can change meaning. Imagine that maybe Shakespeare is sad, and he's sad for the loss of his child, and instead of writing this to a woman, he has written this about his lost child. It's a mourning. It's an elegy, which we learned in the last unit with Beowulf. Let's say that this is an elegy, a poem about memorializing the death of someone. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. You're more lovely, you're more pleasant than a summer's day. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's leaves hath all too short a date. That could be that foreshadowing that the summer of childhood for the child was too short. Maybe. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and oft is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair declines, by chance or by nature's changing course untrimmed. We're caught to nature when it comes to our mortality. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. His child, having died, is an eternal summer. You'll be forever beautiful, if only in my heart. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. As time goes by, death cannot even brag. It has taken the amazing beauty of my child, of you, my child, and washed it out. Then we move on to that heroic couplet again. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, the poem, and this gives life to thee. I am hoping, as a father, if I'm Shakespeare, that this poem lives on forever. Because in that way, he gives honor and life to the child that I mourn. Same words. But to me, even the tone changes from love, 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 love to mourning, to celebrating the child that was and is no more. Context can be a powerful thing. I am not saying that's what Shakespeare wrote it for. We don't know. There's no way to know. Chances are he probably wrote it about romantic love. But context can make a difference. And you're not wrong if you like that interpretation. We can't interview Shakespeare and tell what he intended. Ask him, what did you intend with this poem? When did you write it? We don't know that. But that's the beautiful thing about poetry. This condensed language allows you to bring your own experiences and your own predilections and create your own interpretation as long as you can back it up in the work. Now, as you answer the questions that I am going to have for you today, I want you to keep something in mind. Number one, you're going to have to pick, in order to answer the questions, one of the things I'm going to have you do is pick which interpretation that you want to go with on it. And your other questions, your other open-ended questions, are going to be based on the interpretation you pick. Is it a romantic poem to a beloved woman, or is it a elegy of a lost child? Whichever one speaks to you and you feel that you can answer the best is the one I want you to go with. But then you're going to defend that answer in the subsequent questions. So, if you have any questions, you can contact me, email me. I'm happy to answer questions. And, hopefully I gave you a poem that you might have thought you knew what it meant and gave you pause to think a little deeper and maybe find beauty in the words of this poem that gets quoted to the point of being cliche normally.